Federal drug crimes are some of, if not the most common type of federal case that I and all other federal criminal defense attorneys work on because they're the most commonly indicted. But how are they punished? How are the sentences imposed and decided? That's what we're talking about on this week's video, so stick around and let's chat about it. Happy Friday, everybody. Hope you're having a great week and gearing up for another good weekend. Today, we're talking about how federal drug sentences are figured out. And as a reminder, I'm only going to hit like the very basic highlights in this video to try to keep it relatively short. But swing by my Twitch channel on Sundays at 7:45. This week, we'll talk about this topic. But every Sunday at 7:45 p.m. Texas time over on Twitch, link below, we talk about whatever interests you, whether it's this or a previous video I did, or if you have a specific question, or we just celebrate you. We celebrate what achievements you've done, what wins you've had this week. So swing by. I'm really trying to grow that channel, and I would love to have you over there hanging out. So federal drug crimes, like I said in the introduction, they're one of, if not the most commonly indicted case in the federal system. There are thousands and thousands of drug conspiracy cases indicted every year. And I say conspiracy because it is not the situation. The federal government, the Department of Justice, typically will not indict a case for a single person that simply possesses some type of drug, no matter what the type of drug it is. Every drug crime that is indicted on the federal level is some sort of conspiracy, and it's typically a conspiracy to possess with the intent to distribute. So it's drug dealing. It's not drug possession. It's not drug use. It's not drug addiction. It's drug distribution, which makes the bulk of the cases that the federal government goes after each year. So when these cases come through, a lot of times what people want to know is, how do the sentences get determined? How do the sentences get figured out? What's a fair and reasonable sentence in each specific case? And the number one factor that determines the sentence is the drug quantity, the weight, okay? And it's not just the weight that that individual had, right? It's the weight of the conspiracy as a whole. So what do I mean by that? If I'm in a drug conspiracy with 3 other people, okay, I'm dealing cocaine, the person number 2 is dealing heroin, the person number 3 is dealing fentanyl, and so on and so forth, okay? Because of the way conspiracy laws work, I don't just get held responsible for the cocaine that I distributed. I get held responsible for the heroin that was distributed. I get responsible for the fentanyl that's distributed. Likewise, if we're all distributing cocaine and I distribute 1 kilogram, I'm a relatively small player, but my cohorts distribute 50 kilograms, 100 kilograms, 200 kilograms, then the conspiracy gets charged as a whole. So I get held responsible for all of their weight. That is the first big shock people get when they come into my office and they've been charged with a federal drug crime. Now, this weight can come into play in 2 different areas, right? The first is in the indictment itself. When you are charged with a drug crime on the federal level, there are 3 different ranges of punishment, statutory ranges of punishment that can apply depending on the weight of the drugs. A relatively small amount of drugs, relatively speaking, will be indicted as what's known as a 0 to 20, a crime that has a statutory minimum of 0 years, so no minimum, but it could be up to 20 years in prison. The second one is what's called a 5 to 40, so a statutory minimum of 5 years up to a maximum of 40 years, right? And then there's the 10 to life range, where there's a minimum of 10 years for the largest quantities of drugs, and it can go all the way up to a life sentence. So that's the first step in determining what your sentence is, to try to figure out what range am I even in. And that's where the weight comes in handy. Or the weight not handy, that's the wrong word, where the weight comes into the calculation, right? So the second place that it does is Federal sentences are determined by using what are called the sentencing guidelines. Now, I've done videos in the past about how the guidelines work. If there's interest, I'd be happy to do a deep dive or a series on the sentencing guidelines, or even better, come by Twitch and we can talk about how the guidelines work in detail, because you can spend an hour talking about that. But regardless, or needless to say, the weight will affect those guidelines. Okay, the guidelines are determined by figuring out what a person's offense level is. That offense level is a number between 1 and 43. The higher the number, the higher the recommended sentence. The higher the weight, the higher the number, right? So you do the math, the higher the weight, the higher the number, the higher the recommended sentence, and that's what's driving these sentences up. There is a huge difference between somebody who has an offense level of, say, 27 and an offense level of, say, 12, right? Those are massive differences when you look at the recommended or advisory sentencing range. So the weight is the key component in figuring out what somebody's guidelines are, because it determines what their offense level is. Are they going to start at a 36? Are they going to start at a 34? Are they going to start at a 28? All those things just make a huge impact in what their final sentence could be. So again, this is just an overview of kind of the number one factor, which is the weight. There are other things that determine what a drug sentence is, such as they're called sentencing enhancements. So that offense level that we talked about earlier, that gets increased or decreased depending on the facts of a specific case. So for example, if you possessed a firearm or a dangerous weapon while you were distributing drugs, there's an increase that happens. If you maintained what's called a stash house or a premises in which you use that place to distribute drugs, you get an increase. If you were a leader or an organizer or a manager or a supervisor of the criminal conspiracy, there's an increase. Likewise, there's decreases if you were a minor participant or a minimal participant. Or there is what's called safety valve, where if you're a first-time offender and you honestly debrief with the government, you get a decrease. So there are ways to adjust that offense level that are very fact-specific, but by far, the number one way that a sentence is determined, it all comes down to quantity. It all comes down to drug weight. So that's the first thing as a defense lawyer that we have to figure out is what weight are we talking about? I hope this was at least somewhat helpful and kind of entertaining. As always, if you have questions about this topic specifically, either drop a comment below or come by my Twitch stream on Sundays. I'd love to discuss it further. I can talk about this for hours, so I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have over there. Until I see you next week, I want everybody out there to have a fantastic weekend, to have a great next week. Be good and stay on the right side of the bars.